Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. My name is Denise Göktürk. I'm a professor in the Department of German, also affiliated with Film and Media here at Berkeley. And it's a great pleasure to be hosting today's Mosse lecture by our distinguished guest, Robert Beavers. Welcome. Who has been in residence at BAMPFA for this past week. He's been very generously showing and discussing programs of his beautifully poetic films. The Robert Beavers residency is co-presented by the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive and the Department of German at UC Berkeley, with support from the Mosse Foundation. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank the chief curator here, Susan Oxtoby, for curating this series with great care and passion, and for giving us this wonderful opportunity to see Beavers' rarely screened old and new films in sequence. I've been learning a lot from our curators over the years, and I greatly cherish our collaborations with BAMPFA. We are so lucky to have the Pacific Film Archive as a place of collective film viewing and discussion in these challenging times of shrinking public spaces. A great deal of behind-the-scenes work goes into fundraising, curation, presentation of these programs. So to start with, let's give a collective round of applause to all the staff here at the theater who work tirelessly to make all this possible. And this includes, of course, the curators, the projectionists, the theater managers, front desk, ushers, all of them. Okay. And so the thanks are not over. I would also like to extend heartfelt thanks to the Mosse Foundation for their continued generous support of the Mosse lectures at Berkeley. This series of public humanities events commemorates not only the well-known historian George Mosse, but also more generally the Jewish German Mosse families' patronage of the arts and their contributions to intellectual life in Berlin during the Weimar Republic and beyond. In particular, Rudolf Mosse, with his publishing house and the influential newspaper Berlin Tageblatt. He was a kind of media mogul of his time. So Mosse lectures have been featured at a number of universities, first at Humboldt Universität in Berlin, now also in Vienna, but the Mosse lectures held here at Berkeley since 2016 have over time developed their own brand with a focus on visual culture, reflecting particularly on the aesthetics and social role of cinematic media. This is the fourth Mosse lecture that we have been able to hold here at the Pacific Film Archive in conjunction with the residency of a prominent filmmaker, Ulrike Ottinger, Werner Herzog, Sergei Losnitsa, and Pınar Öğrenci were past visitors. And we are hoping to continue this tradition and cooperation in the future. So thanks are also due to our promotional partners for this series, for the Robert Beavers series, the Townsend Center for the Humanities at UC Berkeley, the San Francisco Cinematheque, Shapeshifters in Oakland, and Lightfield. It's great to see the Pacific Film Archive connected both to campus and to film communities in the larger Bay Area. So, turning to our special guest, who is no stranger to Berkeley. We only met during this residency, but Robert has been to Berkeley previous times. He, being born in Massachusetts, Robert Beavers has been making films since his teenage years. He tells me he dropped out of high school, of prep school, and moved to New York in 1965 at the age of 16, I think. Then with his partner at the time, Gregory Markopoulos, on to Europe in 1967, where he has lived since in various locations, also traveling back and forth to the States, in Zurich, the Greek islands, and Berlin, where he is based today, now with also a fellow filmmaker, Ute Aurand. In New York, he was part of the New American Cinema, founded by cinema organization founded by Gregory Markopoulos and Jonas Mekas. So he intersected with the American avant-garde of experimental filmmakers. In fact, Jonas Mekas wrote about Robert Beavers in 1971. So here is Robert Beavers, a filmmaker as a young artist, giving us work after work after work. And this work is not like anything any other film artist has given us, because really what he is giving us is a new film language, or the beginnings of a new film language. So, and that is indeed a fitting characterization, I think, throughout his lifelong practice of making films, which all probe the frames of perception and abstraction, the possibilities of documenting a place, of capturing life in a particular city. And of course, always also the intricacies of the Bolex camera. Beavers has continuously promoted a poetic film language that focuses the viewer's attention on details in everyday life, intimacy, and art in motion. So the series shown here over the past week has been presenting his 18-film cycle, which is titled My Hand Outstretched to the Winged Distance and Sightless Measure. It includes re-edited earlier works, which have been remastered, shortened, or with new sound design. So you will see in today's program 2 Berlin-based films, one made during Beavers' first encounter with that city in 1970. Diminished Frame. And at that time, he was a very young fellow in the supported by the German Academic Exchange Service, DAAD's artist program. And it is a meditation on framing, as you will see, but it also captures something of the spirit of the walled-in Berlin. The gray tones resonated with me immediately when I saw it, because they were still there when I moved to Berlin 10 years later. The second film, you'll see The Sparrow Dream from 2022, is quite different in color scheme and mood, as you will see. So it's also an arc of early work and more present engagement. And I'm sure we can touch on the whole question of mediations of place, but also framing in the discussion. I'd also like to mention that there are these two new books on Robert's work that are available from the bookstore if you want to look at them. By Rebecca Rutkoff, and the biannual Tenemus Film Festival here will be happening again next year. This year in Greece. I'm being told it's the last one. You said, yeah. With all that said, Robert, we very much look forward to watching these films and engaging with you in a conversation about your cinematic practice and environment and engagement. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Robert Beavers.
PFA and etc. and public. I will speak. I don't have a lecture. I have only comments to make and offer the films, and we'll speak between the two films, and then speak with Denise in a relaxed way about my experiences, period. I will speak a little bit about Diminished Frame first. 1970, I had been invited to Berlin the year before, 1969, and invited by Ulrich Gregor, who founded a group called the Friends of the German Cinemathek. And I showed, it may have been one of the very first invitations for me to show films, period. So he was a adventuresome and kind individual. I can remember landing at Tempelhof, which was, there were the sectors in Berlin, and the British, I think, had a military airport, and the French had Tegel, and the Americans had, I believe, Tempelhof. So I had not a word of German. So it was totally foreign to me. I was coming from Switzerland, and it was, Gregor was very, very kind. And he, in the public were filmmakers like Rosa von Prondheim and others. And I was taken then to meet a writer named Walter Hassenklever at the Literarische Kolloquium. And out of that came my fellowship to go back to Berlin the next year. And that was really complicated. It's so important when you know the language of a place. And I struggled with Berlin as it was in 1970, but I was determined to make a film. And some of you have already seen the film in the cycle. It is really simply looking at the city, and without a cultural connection, without a cultural background. I must say, my background was from Massachusetts and from New York, and from a general suspicion of the Germans. Anglo-Saxon suspicion of the Germans. And I had a French-Canadian grandmother who would say, oh, and even though she was not directly from France, what they did to us. And so it was really very, very interesting to encounter different perspectives from the very beginning of my being in Europe. For instance, from a Belgian supporter, I encountered the idea, how romantic the Germans are. And this was completely different than looking at Otto Preminger in the movies. Having said that, I think I would let you look at the first film and then speak about the second film in between. Thank you. So I want to say that the way that I began to make films and and the influences and the points of inspiration were formal. So when I look at Diminished Frame now, and I see it as an important step because it's the first film where a city is the center and the character forming the film. Earlier films, I had a kind of character. I placed a single individual as the center of the film. But with the formal elements, meaning the masks, the filters, the various meanings that come with change of focus, this acts like a magnet, as if all of the picking up filings, iron filings, and as I move the camera around in the city, I'm attracting various sides to the city. I'm reacting to them. So in a way, the realistic, factual, black and white views of Berlin in 1970 are one level of the film, and then and black and white in relation to history. And of course, I did pick certain locations which have historic significance. But then the eye, you could say, the filmmaker speaking, is in the shorter, colored, in and out of focus of refilming the frames of the black and white images. So that's what I saw today. And of course, it is part of the cycle of, it's a group of 5 films made between 68 and 70, or 67 and 70. And then these monthly studies are placed between them. And in this case, I find it, it says a great deal to me about my own biography, that it goes from Berlin to Switzerland and then to the island of Kos and back to Switzerland. So that was my first encounter with Berlin, not my first encounter with Germany, because in 1967 I was invited by the University Film Club in Cologne to do a tour of 5 cities with Markopolis's films, because he was in Denver, I think it was Denver, at a film lab editing. And so I was sent on this tour, and I encountered university students in first Cologne, and then Kiel and Bonn and Heidelberg. I think those were the cities that universities that I went to. And it was still a Germany very connected to the Second World War, as was Berlin, to some degree in 1970, at least from my perspective. And then later, in the 80s, I lived for several years. My base at Gregory's base moved from Switzerland to Munich. So then I encountered a very different Germany in the 80s, only 10 years later. I mean, I feel that this enormous changes took place in Germany in the 70s. And so for whatever reason, there were complex reasons, but we lived in Munich and worked with film labs in Munich, and found ways to continue to make films. And Germany has been, in my 50 some odd, almost 60 years of filmmaking, a very important support. And I could speak at length about what it means to make films that are not part of a commercial enterprise, and how one does that. But I will just try to make it very brief and say that Munich, with its history, which is very different from Berlin, it was possible, and it still is an important point of support for my work. But I've never made a film there. So now to the second film, which you'll see now. I never imagined that I would live in Berlin, and it happened actually because of Ute Aurand. And I met Ute at the Film Museum in Vienna, which is the main collector in Europe of my work, and constant, and over decades. And that is because of Peter Kubelka, one of the 2 founders of the Film Museum. And it's also very interesting, this contrast within the German language sphere, this enormous contrast between film culture in Vienna and film culture in Berlin or other German cities. So out of that, Ute with Renata Sami and Karl Heil and Bärbel Freund had created a film group, and they showed they showed all kinds of film in the Kino Babylon in Berlin, and she invited me. And because I encountered this group of filmmakers, I gained, Film Samstag was the name of the group. I gained a very different perspective on Berlin in the late 80s. So, is that right? No, the late 90s. Sorry, one decade later. And I kept, after Mark Opels's death in 92, I kept the archive in Switzerland and worked in Switzerland and traveled to Greece and was in Germany. But it was only later in 2003 that I moved to Berlin, and also still worked between Zurich and Berlin, and kept a place in outside of Zurich. So after living in Berlin for many, many years, and it is a city that I did not choose for the city. I chose, as it turned out, for the people, or for one person, and then a whole group of filmmakers. And out of that came gradually my different perspective. And when I began the Sparrow Dream, I began it with a view of the location, the same location that ends Diminished Frame. So, which is the milestone. I think it's called a milestone. It's 1 mile from the center of Berlin, and it is opposite. It's in Charlottenburg. I think I would. But this film is of two places. It is. The source is my life at that time, moving back and forth between Massachusetts and Berlin. So, having said that, the Sparrow Dream.
Thank you. This last one is so moving and so beautiful. The Sparrow Dream. I love it because it's this meditation about migration and this fluidity between places, but also making a home. The stove.
Yes.
I had one of those in Berlin. It's really very, very beautiful.
I think you're right. I'm about migration and fluidity.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Well, it's also your take on the Odyssey, right?
From my childhood. Yes.
Yeah. So since this is a then and now program, I was also thinking, maybe you could reflect a little bit on what has changed in your practice. I would also be curious to hear, the first film is so much about, the play with the filters and the frames and the whole apparatus of the filmmaker. And, in the second one, that has become more implicit. It's still there, the play with the frames. But I would also be interested in hearing, when you re-edited the first film more recently, right? What did you change? What changed between then and now?
A general statement about revising. It changes and it doesn't change. That's really mysterious, because you have, while you're revising, you think it's changing, I'm doing this, and then when you look at it, in some ways it hasn't. I mean, with Diminished Frame, on a form level, it changed because I had colors superimposed over the black and white. So some of these, where the filters are coming in and out of focus, those were more often superimposed over the black and white.
Yeah.
Which of course is a different, totally different image. But
so that's new, or
no, that was the first version.
That was in the original.
That was that was in the original that I had printed on more than one band. The superimpositions in the printing, and I took all of that away. And so in the version that you just saw, of course, there are no superimpositions over the images. Yeah.
But otherwise, no big changes.
I don't know anymore.
Yeah.
I think the order is the same. The order of the images is the same. I can remember it begins actually. The view is the view out of the window in the pension where I was staying, of the trees and the birds, and that wonderful iron sunburst, and the doorway was the doorway to the pension. And I think Meinecke Strasse.
Yeah. And that cross
on the wall, I just saw it. It was a what do you call it? A firewall.
A firewall.
Yes. Yeah.
So would you say, sort of your practice of filmmaking, has there been a major shift from 1971 to 2022?
That's easy to answer. Okay. Yes. And it's a it's really a shift. I wouldn't even call it a shift. I would call it a totally different valuing and loosening, actually. One way of thinking about it is loosening, and in the early films, I can feel my isolation in some way. To some degree, or this concentration, also wonderful concentration that was possible at that moment, and in the later work, I'm not so determined to construct a film like From the Notebook of or Ruskin, films that are very serious and have strong on that level of form. I am moving in a different direction, and actually, the program on Saturday is very important because of the sequence of 7 films, and
those are the most recent films.
Recent, the last 20 years. So I'm going to jump around a little bit. I tend to jump. So I read a wonderful. There are some books that stay with you for a lifetime, and one of these was the I don't know if it's called Secret Treatises, but I think it is. I think it's Secret Treatises of Zeami, the Japanese No master, who wrote wonderful treatises, which very often have to do with actors and acting and the flower of the actor at different ages, and that and Basho, the walk into the interior, gave me the idea of moments, the difference between lyric and prose moments, and intensified my sense of searching for place. So, and that combined with important matters in my own life is what's forming the later work. In the earlier work, it is more this. I mean, I was 21 when I made the segments and Diminished Frame. So
it's more exploring the camera.
Well, exploring with place, the camera and place, and and the playfulness, the freedom of that time. I felt very privileged, even though it was not always easy, to have the freedom to do my work. That was perhaps the center of my experience at that time.
I mean, those were turbulent times in Berlin, 1970. Right.
We have talked about that. Yes, but I ignored all of that.
Tell us a little bit. How did
if you don't know German, it was easy.
Well, so these were the days of the anti-Vietnam War protests, and sort of young rebellious filmmakers at the German Film Academy, the FFB, were really, probing the political efficacy of cinema, and and you actually did come into contact with them. Briefly, right?
I think I met them briefly because my host, Mr. Greger, in '69, he was teaching also at the DFFB at that moment, and he took me to show my films there.
But
to them.
You don't remember how they reacted, do you?
I don't.
So Harun Farocki was one of them, and Helke Zander, and
I don't remember. I don't remember any women at the school, but she must have. She was there. Yes, right. But Denise, it's all more nuanced than one imagines.
I'm sure.
That's the interesting thing of his life,
so
life and history. Life and history. Yes, there are many. My goodness. I'm thinking, for instance, of having by chance visited Leni Riefenstahl in her apartment on her 80th birthday.
Wow. That was Munich, though, right?
That was Munich.
Yeah.
And I think one can't, I mean, Germany, you have to deal with nuances.
Everywhere.
Everywhere, yes, everywhere. Here also, yes. Yeah, and now I will jump again and say that at the moment I am totally absorbed in a wonderful poet who lived here, and Czesław Miłosz. So I find his perspective and the fact that he moved between these places and very inspiring. Yeah. So with history and so forth, then I would bring him in also.
you did mention Rosa von Braunheim, of course. In those years, you were connected also to the
He,
emerging gay
yeah,
film scene.
I mean, not so much, but
Not-
he was Gregory's assistant
Ah,
in Munich for 2 operas
uh-huh.
in '68, and then he was in a way my host. He took me around Berlin,
Mhm.
but I think I never met him again afterwards.
After-
Yeah, I had always more appreciation for his colleague Werner Schreuter.
All right. Mhm.
This as
Much crazier.
maybe
Yeah. Mhm.
more hitting things on really directly.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm also curious, of course, sort of with this whole remediation of your earlier work, so you did not decide to make any of your films available digitally or kind of, sort of release them for DVD or streaming or, so I mean, this probably connects with what you were hinting at earlier on, the kind of making non-commercial cinema,
Yes.
right? But
The whole economics.
but
It's really it touches on the whole economics and
yeah. But of course, that also limits the circulation and distribution. So we don't get to see them that easily, right? So I'm curious, sort of why.
But
right,
Denise, I'm very interested in the film event,
in the
the projection event,
okay.
and
Mhm.
I said that before. So this is a part of it. If I mean, it may be only a romantic nonsense that I am not doing it, and I'm not totally opposed. But you need a partner for this also, and with my limited means, the means that I have to invest in the new filmmaking and analog and making copies still of analog copies. And I would have to have another partner for to go into the digital. Yeah. I have done it once with the Film Museum in Vienna for one film. But yeah. But in general, it has to it can change. I think all of these things are not fixed in stone.
If a donor turns up who would issue a DVD edition, you wouldn't say no.
No, we can try. We can try. Yes.
Is this my sign? Okay.
Yes. Okay.
We have 5 more minutes, and then we can open.
We have 5 minutes.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. What else did I? Yeah, I also I did want to talk a little bit about your camera, because you were saying you stuck with a Bolex camera pretty much throughout your career. So what's special about the Bolex camera and sort of the image you can achieve with it, but also sort of working with it. It's very much a character in your films also. So. Speaking as the man with the movie camera. So what is...
A 16 millimeter is a 16 millimeter camera is something you can do alone. You can hold it, you can carry it, and 35 is a little more difficult. And since I also work very often with a tripod, it means carrying the tripod and the camera, and with the 35 you want a battery, it's not like the mechanical. The Bolex is like a watch, an old watch, and so it's manageable for one person, and I think that's very
attractive.
important. Of course, there are other formats now, and almost immediately after I began, there was Super 8. But I haven't seen any reason to go to something else. I have filmed a little bit in 35, but that's when I discovered it was so. It's difficult for one person, and it's also at least twice as expensive. So I stayed with the 16, and when you ask me this, I'm thinking color, for instance.
Color.
Yes, the film stocks, and that's probably what keeps me from not going so into the digital realm.
It's just not the same.
No, it's not. For me, it's not the same, but it may only have to do with biography. That's where I began, and this is the color that I see, and I mean, it has changed because I have gone from so-called reversal material, which is a positive image that you can print from, to negative. And that's in the two films here. One's reversal, one's negative.
Yeah, I think it's probably time to open it up for questions. I can already see one right here in the middle. The microphone is coming your way.
Thanks. I have two questions. One is the Berlin film, aspects of it reminded me of paintings of Gerhard Richter. So I was wondering whether you knew his work, and is that one of the things you had in mind?
No.
Yeah. Okay. The other...
Which one though? The first one or the second?
Yeah, the first one. The other question is, did you ever think of what you were doing as documentary?
Yes.
Yes, we have talked about this actually, that these films...
Although I think I would never use the word. But I do see it as documentary, yes. I mean, documentary in the sense of moving towards reality. That's all. I wouldn't.
An engagement with...
Yes, engagement, yes. So not classical in the sense of aesthetics.
I mean, I think it's all about probing the possibility of making a documentary, right? So that's how I see it, So, yeah. More questions? There is one right here.
Hi, Robert. The presence of your own voice really kind of struck me in... I'm already forgetting the name of the film. The Sparrow Dream. It's something that I didn't notice during any of your other films throughout, the prior saga, and it's something that I haven't really noticed during any of your other films. I was just curious, kind of, what was the catalyst behind maybe using your own voice, or maybe what previously prevented you from using it to begin with?
Well, I actually used it in my very first film, made in 1966, and I have a few words in Picture of Colored Light, which is the first film in this in the later cycle of films. And this is the only time that I have used something which would... I was thinking about this yesterday. I thought I should call it a voice in between, not a voice over. Because I did place it in black most of the time.
In between, yes.
Yes.
One place and the other.
Right. So I dared it. Yeah.
Yeah. It also... There is one? Okay. Yeah, you go ahead. Come in your...
Thank you so much, Robert. Yeah, I was curious. So something I've really admired in your films, I think from the ground onward is, and including The Sparrow Dream, is many of them feel quite elegiac. You spoke in your introduction how over the course of the cycle, character-driven films kind of give way to films that are about places. And these later films seem to kind of return to characters as kind of the central motivation. So I'm sort of curious to hear about, sort of how you see the films, or if you see the films kind of as elegies of sorts to all of these different people in your life.
The cycle is, what stands behind it is my life with Gregory Markopoulos. So it stands behind every film in that cycle, and then there was the 10 years of working on the sound. So that was in that period I made only The Ground. And at that point I knew that something was complete, and then it took me time to find. It's interesting that it concentrated on how to move the camera. So starting with Picture of Colored Light, there is a different way of moving the camera, and there's a different orientation between what moves in the frame and when the frame moves. So on a formal level. And I came back to the United States and made the first film that I made here since 1966. So I had not made a film in the States between 1966 and 2000. So there are big differences. Also, I returned, but continuities also. I returned to the sense of color in relation to psyche. So emotive color, and whereas even in The Ground, it is a subdued palette. Also in the Hedge Theatre. So I see that I have been very fortunate. The program this evening is the culmination of that first entire life, and then the Saturday program is a full cycle of films of the last 20 years of my life. And as I mentioned, I am working on a film, but it is not connected to anything else that I have done.
What is it? Now we're curious.
It actually is mostly in black and white, and it has some things unusual. It surprises me because I am also have returned to scratching on film.
Scratching on film.
Yes, which in The Count of Days I had done once with those scalpel instruments. So it's graphic. So sometimes I'm thinking of film as graphic. And I have also
it's totally abstract.
No, it's not. It's
still documentary.
The source. It's more documentary. The source is a friend's studio and his work, and actually his living space. And I filmed his living space in 1999 and put it aside. I didn't know what it was, and now I have gone back, and so the film will be in two parts. I mean, not two parts, but it will have these two sources because the last year and a half I have been filming in his studio.
In Berlin or in the
Ridgewood, New York.
New York.
Part of New York City. Yeah. Yeah. But I am also filming in Berlin, and there I'm thinking early 19th century Germany and the wonders of certain people, like, you'll be surprised, Goethe and Schinkel.
Oh, Schinkel.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Classicism.
Yes, but also dealing with geology.
And
I don't know about
architecture.
classicism. He looks very
architecture.
classic, but architecture.
Yeah,
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I have filmed the Findlings in yes.
Yeah, we have a question
Yes,
there,
good.
2 questions there. Yes.
Hi, Robert. I
Hello.
was curious about your process for the words in the second film. Would you say that the film inspired the words, or the other way around, or a little bit of both?
I think you're the first. Yeah, mostly. I did take one phrase out, so I have changed the soundtrack a little bit.
What did you take out?
Fatherland, motherland.
That was in there.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's not now. Since then, I've taken it out. I did the soundtrack a second time.
So this is a work in progress.
When you work with a film lab, it's always a work in progress.
We're good. I think there were 2 questions outside.
Hello, Robert. I really enjoyed watching your films. I had 2 questions for you. While I was watching your film, it felt very nostalgic to me. And I was wondering, are your films by any chance inspired by poetry?
They are
my
poetry.
impulse would be to say no, but but it's probably not true. So I'm not. It's complicated because I read poetry, but I'm a filmmaker. So the sources are in filmmaking, and
And then my other question was, before you film your films, do you have a specific aesthetic in mind before you start filming?
no. But it goes organically, in the sense that, for instance, the last 7 films are an organic unit, and then you reach a point, like I did at the end of The Ground, that I know something is finished, but I don't choose consciously an aesthetic. I hope it's much more connected to my life. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much again for your time. I specifically had a question about your editing process and the choices that you make. I know you mentioned just now that you shoot in a more organic fashion when choosing shots. I specifically wanted to ask, when forming the final sequence, have you ever had a moment where you had to cut something entirely out or reshoot something entirely because of the way that the shot came out, or had to edit an entire film over again, or many mistakes in that vein?
Wait a minute. Could you say that? Sorry. Repeat.
Oh, that's fine. This is a technical question on the editing process for you.
Yes.
I specifically wanted to ask about if you ever had to reshoot or re-edit an entire sequence because it did not come out the way that you wanted to for the overall goal or narrative for the particular scene.
I think I more likely would have thrown something out, but not refilmed. Yeah, I think that's correct.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation so far. I had a question about the first film. There are several shots of historical sites which are well known, like the ruins of the Reichstag and a sliver of a piece of the Schloss Charlottenburg. But there are also there's also conspicuous presence of U-Bahn stations, Bülowstraße, Möckernbrücke, Zoo, and I wanted to ask if what led to the inclusion of the train station specifically.
Metro.
Yeah, they seemed important to me, and in that first visit, or in that first period when I was in Berlin, I did have the experience of taking the S-Bahn into East Berlin, That was
That's not in there, though.
no, that was an event. I didn't take a camera with me.
That was
That
forbidden.
would be that would be problematic. Yes, I have a train station in another film also, and actually in the film that I'm working on, I'm thinking of the Friedrichstrasse train station from the exterior. It's an extraordinary exterior.
Mhm.
Yeah. But other than that, I can't tell you why. Yeah.
Microphone is coming.
I was curious about the choice of sound in the first film. So between the frames, it sounds like there's a flutter of bird wings. But is that
Yes.
okay? And then also I guess could you just tell us about the sound palette
In the
I
first
guess.
film.
Yes.
Yes.
There's a Z Kyle.
Yes.
Yeah. I yes.
But no, I have a very definite. This is one of the few times when I had a definite source, and it comes from Elias Canetti, and his description of the Mass, and so I used the sounds which for me suggested the Mass, which were horses stampeding, bees, flames, because fire is something that can go out of control. And I'm also using them together, so you might hear all of them at the same time, and then one at one point, one at another point.
But the wing sound
Yes.
is actually recurring in
Through all of my
multiple in the whole
5
cycle,
films.
I
Yes,
think.
yes,
Mhm.
yes.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. Even to the last film. Yes.
It's interesting about fire because in the second film, fire is totally resignified, right?
Yes.
That's
Fire in the second film is more hearth.
Yeah.
Yes.
The hearth.
Yes.
Exactly. I think we're out of time, unless there is one last question. Yeah.
But I thank you very much for being here.
Thank you all for
Yes.
being here. And
Yes.
tonight at 7, there is one more program, mostly Greece-based films, right? Rome and Greece. And then Saturday is the important program of the kind of last 20 years of filmmaking by Robert Beavers. Thank you very much.